All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the Game Development Livestream. This is a industry talk where we are from the game industry, and it's for game designers, game developers, anybody who works in the industry. Of course, if you're from outside the industry and you just want to learn what we do in this crazy industry of making, funding, designing, building, shipping, operating games, have at it. Maybe you'll catch this crazy mental disorder that we all share in the industry and want to join us on this ride. So I hope we infect you with that, and that's one of the side effects. It's kind of like a zombie apocalypse, but we all become game developers eventually. So what we're talking about today is game funding, and we've got a couple of industry veterans I'm about to introduce you to, but I today am joined by my co-host, Paul. Paul, thanks for joining yet again.
Super excited to be here. I think it's going to be a good show today.
And our intrepid producer, Oscar, who tells me important things like I started talking about the show, but we weren't even live yet. Thank you, Oscar. He pushed the button. We're live. We're actually out there. I see the audience coming in. So thanks for joining us today. All right, let me start with some intros here. So I'm Jon Radoff. I'm the CEO of a company called Beamable. We're a development platform for the back end of games. Paul, what do you do?
I've been making games for a good quarter century. Large teams, small teams, fat teams, tall teams, all the kinds of teams. These days I'm focused on free-to-play mobile games, but yeah, I've worked at all kinds of studios. My words are my own, not those of my employer.
Thanks for that legal disclaimer, Paul. It'll never get old. We should make a little boilerplate thing we can queue up in the assets. Hey, Larry, why don't you introduce yourself?
Larry Kuperman, better known as Larry Nightdive, head of biz dev for Nightdive Studios, a division of Atari. And I've also been in the industry for about 25 years. I like to say that I'm a deal maker and a heartbreaker.
All right, we're going to talk about a lot of heartbreak soon enough, but hopefully some deals as well. Justin, Welcome to the show. Why don't you introduce
Thanks
yourself?
for having me. Justin Berenbaum, VP of Strategy and GM of Xsolla Funding. To be clear, that is not about Xsolla actually funding games. It's helping developers find funding. I've spent most of my career starting in '93 at Capcom, doing publishing, investing, funding, biz dev, strategy. And I'm always happy to be here, share insights, and hopefully if we have time for audience questions, because obviously there's a ton of stuff going on or not going on in the industry with funding right now. So,
yeah, and good point, Justin. So while we're here, let's talk about the culture of this show. If you're tuning in for the first time, then you are in for something that's a little different than most live streams work. First of all, yes, of course you can put comments wherever you're viewing it. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, we're on Twitch, we're on X, we're on LinkedIn. So we're all over the place. We've got audience across a whole bunch of different platforms watching this live right now. And if you post in the comments, we are more than happy to bring those up. Ask the tough questions. Like this is going to be a talk today about really something that's vital to the heart of the industry right now, which is if you have a game idea, how do you get it funded? Is there hope that you can get it funded? People are saying it's really hard right now. And I think it is really hard, but games they are getting funded. So we can talk about that and what's happening. So do post the comments and also share your experiences. It's not just us talking to you. You're part of this conversation, right? It's not a talk. It's like you can go to GDC, you can go to conferences like I'm at right now. Like you can listen to talks, but we are actually really interested in the conversation, the interactive aspect with not you, the audience, but you, the community that are part of this. And what that also means is if you'd like to join live, this is actually an open stage. So Oscar is going to be watching the different channels. And if you want to join in, if you would have something that you want to say about game funding or really anything that's relevant like today, this week in the game industry, you can join us and be part of the conversation live. You just need a camera and we'll get you right in. All right, so with that preamble, let's dive right into the ever popular subject in the game industry. How do I fund my game? So let's talk about a few of the options. Let's actually talk about like big picture what the options are. So Justin, you just explained that you're in a part of Xsolla where you help, would you call it advise companies as to how they can get funding for their game project?
I think that's on a grand scale, I mean, I do one-on-one, but I think it's more, we have set up a platform that allows I want to say it's a highly curated digital matchmaking platform for free that allows easier connections globally between developers making games and publishers and investors that are investing games all over the globe. I think one of the biggest things, depending on where you're from, especially from emerging market, is you don't actually have access to a lot of the publishers and investors that are investing in games. And believe it or not, a lot of publishers and investors don't have access to a lot of great developers globally. So what we tried to do is really just build a global matchmaking platform. I think Xsolla is at 100 trade shows a year, and the number one question we get at every single trade show is, where do I find funding? I think anybody who's been in the industry for more than 10 minutes has probably heard that question. We get it a lot, so we decided to try to help people find the places where there's funding. And to get back to your other question, I'm sure we'll dive deeper. Yes, funding is still happening. It is taking much longer than it was before. It is much more difficult, and the deals are smaller than they were a few years ago. But I want to be clear, and I think sometimes we forget this because we had this ridiculous period of growth. There were no actual game-specific VCs until 2017 or 2018 when London Venture Partners kind of jumped in and was just focused on games. So while things are tough now, the funding environment for games has always been brutal. It's just that it went from a period of kind of unbridled ridiculousness to dropping back to kind of the old normal. And I think that pain is being felt across the industry. And I have data on, too many games and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think that's the long and short of it is games are still being funded. You just have more competition than ever for that funding.
Now you're talking about gaming funds like venture capital, basically.
That's one place, yes.
Of course, that's not the only way to fund a game. There's still this thing called game publishers. They exist too. They're still funding games.
Yeah, and so I use that broadly.
But no, we want to talk about all of those, and I think it's interesting to maybe bucket some of the different things. There's also some that have been maybe more popular in the past relative to today, although I think there's nothing that's gone away completely. So I'll give examples of that. Kickstarter at one time was probably a bigger source of new game funding. Today, I would say it's harder to fund a game on Kickstarter because there have been a lot of disappointments there, but continues to be successful. Just last week, we had Raf Koster on the show, and he talked about Stars Reach and the game he was working on. They launched their Kickstarter a couple days ago, I think, and
they're
my
213%. 213% as of this morning.
Yeah, they hit their target in the first hour, right? So. And we should talk about the dynamics that went into that Kickstarter, because I think you may hear that as a game developer and you're like, fantastic. I don't give up equity. I don't give up revenue share. Like, let's go. I'm in. Let's do that again. Like they had to do a lot to get that. So Kickstarter still viable for certain kinds of games at a certain stage of development. Web3 was all the rage a few years ago. I'm literally at a Web3 conference right now. This is not a game related thing. This is DPIN, which is a whole infrastructure thing we don't need to talk about on this particular show. But there are, believe it or not, there are still Web3 game studios. Some of them are getting funding. It is way, way harder than it was even 6 months ago. It got really hard 2 years ago, then it got easier again, and then it got way harder again. So that's kind of where we are there.
Is AI crowding them out? Now we got to say AI 15 times in a pitch.
You can go to Claude and just say, "Hey, I'd make me a game like this," and it spits out.
No, I meant like you got your pitch has to be centered around AI to get the love, right?
I'm a little skeptical.
There's a few months there that worked.
We really prefer a Web3 AI generated. We really prefer a Web3 AI generated blockchain.
Right.
That's the. You're trying to get as many buzzwords.
You didn't slip a free to play in there, though. It's got to be free to play in there too, right?
Yeah.
Well, I will tell you though, so I recently did a Series A. We announced so BITKRAFT is one of the major.
Congratulations!
Thank you. Yeah, it was a very long process, to tell you the truth. But we raised a $13.5 million round led by BITKRAFT, which is a VC known for both games as well as technology and infrastructure. And I think there was like almost a received wisdom in the game industry, which was like funding a game is really hard, but hey, if you can figure out a way to pivot to technology or have a technology play in your company and the game is just a stealth way to promote the tech, that's the glide path to easy funding. All I can tell you is that was not my experience. If someone has done that, I'm happy for them. I found, we want to get back to game funding, but I'll share the quick experience I had on that. So there's a ton of people that invest in software and they're scared of games. Not that games aren't software, but specifically they're scared of games, don't really understand games, what makes them work. And it's not so much that, they'll never invest in games, but anything that touch games also confuses them because they think that games are these strange, magical entities that have special needs that cannot be satisfied through normal software, right? So the vast majority of software investors will not really look at game tech as a category, although to their credit, some really big funds like Sequoia, for example, backed Unity. So historically, it's happened for certain cases and it's gone really well for some folks. But by and large, my experience is that money is not particularly readily available. And then at the flip side, most of the game funds, well, many of them will talk about game tech or infrastructure as being part of their strategy. Sort of my reality was there wasn't a lot of expertise to be able to make technology investments. They weren't SaaS investors or software investors. They were game investors. And a lot of them either came from a game publishing background or really felt they understood games, but didn't necessarily understand technology or at least were not comfortable with earlier stage risk in technology. Maybe they would invest in something that's really scaled out already and had already won. So that was my experience. I found game tech really hard to fund. So it's not, if you're a game, here's the real message I have. If you're a game and some guy is telling you, hey, figure out the tech, proprietary tech strategy to really convince the VCs to get behind you. If you want to build a tech for sure. Nothing wrong with that, but I think it's hard to do both. And I don't think most people will succeed at trying to do both. Anyways, that's that. Are there any other category? So we talked about VCs, publishers.
No, so we want to run through this, right? So publishers, there's VCs, there's debt financing. And let's also be clear, there's project financing and equity financing. There's debt. There is, I guess the crowdfunding stuff, whether you do it on a Kickstarter or you kind of do your own, like Julian Gallup did when he did his last game, he built his last studio. They kind of built their own direct channel so they could keep it ongoing and change it out. I think that, the number of funding options and there's still the friends and family, beg, borrow a neighbor. There's all of that kind of stuff is still viable. I think that you've got to be careful about depending your livelihood on any one model, but I'm also going to say this to most developers out there that are, especially ones that are just working on their first, second titles, you are probably not in a position to take equity. I know that most of you think that it's, money is money. In most cases, you're not actually in a position to really take equity. You're not in a position to actually get VC funding. I think you're running the risk of giving up too much too early. And frankly, most VCs aren't doing early stage small developer investing anymore. So I do think you need to be very clear about what you need, who you're building it for, and then the avenues that make the most sense. Because I get a lot of pitches from companies in Malaysia, Thailand, Latin America, even from the US, these small companies working on $500,000 games that are trying to sell equity in their game. And John, you gone the equity path. You know how difficult. Sometimes raising too little money is actually a bigger problem than raising too much money when it comes to a VC. And let's be clear, games never really fit a pure traditional VC model, right? Because we're so hit driven, because predictability is, I would say pretty damn small. Most of us on this show and most of us do this, we can always pick a bad game and we can generally pick a good game, but we can't always pick a good game that's going to make a lot of money, right? That's the magic crystal ball.
Yeah.
And VCs, by the way, and publishers aren't really much better at it than any of the rest of us. They just have more money to make more bets to find the ones that are successful.
And I will say that the risk of failure is probably lower for them because they have infrastructure. But look, I'm going to oversimplify what Justin just said. Anytime you make a deal, the important question to ask is, you know what you want to get out of the deal. What does the person on the other side want to get out of the deal? And if you're looking at going into getting funding from a venture capitalist, the question that you have to ask is, how long do I have to generate 10x the amount of money that you're going to invest? Because if you make a deal thinking, well, I've now assured the continuance of my studio will be making games for the next 20 years, and your investor expects to pull their cash out in 6 months, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah. Now the VC model is relatively patient typically. The average VC investment doesn't provide liquidity for
it's an exaggeration, John. It is. And truly, I mean, nobody's expecting the 10x in 6 months. Nobody realistic is anyway. But if they start asking you what your exit strategy is, and you anticipated running that studio for the rest of your life, that's probably a tell that you're not on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that if you're raising venture capital, even if you're not immediately trying to sell the company, you basically put a for sale sign on the company, because that's what VCs do. They invest in companies that can achieve liquidity, typically through a sale and then rarely through an IPO. Or
if that's your goal as a studio head or as somebody in the studio, if that's what you want to do. I mean, I know people that are serialists in the studio business. Open one up, do one thing, move on to something else. That's great. But that wasn't my goal. That wasn't Steve Kick's goal, my senior partner at Nightdive. We wanted to do this for a long time. We wanted to build something. So we did another technique. Steve found a business opportunity at the beginning, and this is before my coming on board, that there was a need for System Shock 2, that there was no way at that time to play System Shock 2 legally, without and easily. I mean, it was one of those things that you download this thing and then all you have to do is in 4 pages of instructions to get it working. He found that was the case, and then found, we've told the story multiple times, and then found that the rights for this beloved franchise were with an insurance company, and that the insurance company had acquired the trademark rights. But in order to continue their trademark, in order to hold on to the trademark rights, they had to demonstrate commercial usage. Right? Well, here's this guy coming up and saying, I'll be happy to help you demonstrate commercial usage. And that worked out. And that's how Nightdive got started. After that, we just followed an easy principle. We made more money than we spent, or we spent less money than we made. And we've done that for over a decade. There were other things on there, but one of the other core lessons, first of all, just backing up on the funding thing, you need to understand what you want. You need to be able to clearly state that, and your funding has to be in alignment with that. If you're looking for somebody that wants to have multiple games in a series that believes in your IP and your vision, then you're probably better off with a publisher.
I think a lot of people would dispute all of the above, Larry, though. Like I'd say, and I'm not here to defend VCs either, and maybe we'll have some of our friends who are VCs join us
I'd love that. That'd be fun.
That would be a lot of fun. But yeah, a lot of VCs would claim that they're the option for much more patient capital because the company retains all of the IP ownership, and they're totally aligned with this is what they would say. They're aligned with the founders, that you have a big exit, everybody wins, put all the value into the company, don't give away your rights to a publisher who will get franchise rights and possibly even IP ownership and things like that make it hard to raise future capital from anyone but the publisher over and over again. So I think many VCs would say that, and publishers would probably say almost the same thing. They'd be like, well, we're the ones who understand how to market and distribute products in in this, and we can, like, we find studios that we really love and we stick with you over time. And how has that worked out? How has the sticking with studios worked out over time, over this last week in particular? Like, I don't know.
Jon, you brought up a
worked.
couple funny things that I want to. So one thing I think we left out is we forgot to mention in this was we didn't mention private equity, which was never a big was on and off a big player in our space previously that people didn't know about. But folks like Haveli and a few others have stepped back in. The perfect example is what happened with Private Division being sold off, purchased by Haveli, and now being reformed with a lot of the ex-Annapurna people. So I do think there's another thing that's happening. And again, this is generally going to only be for established studios or people with IP, but private equity is there. And there's also this weird new partnership thing that seems to be happening between VCs and private equity and IP holders. It almost goes back a little bit to the joint venture movie model, where people with really big IPs are either starting game development or interested but don't have the stomach for it, are going to start partnering with private equity firms and or VCs to form joint ventures that will then own that game creation. And I can't name studios or whatever, but just imagine your, friendly neighborhood IP holder, movie, film, TV studio having some big IPs they want to turn into games. The big traditional, the Activisions, EAs, Ubisoft aren't signing many of those big deals anymore. So they're looking at ways to do this, and they're finding partners that are interested, and they're going to share the risk. I actually think that is something that, it's relatively new to our industry. It's old to the movie business. I think we're going to see more of that over the next couple of years as those become safer bets per se for some of these folks. And I do think there'll be opportunities for studios that are really talented at converting IP into games moving forward. But I think that's one piece we definitely didn't talk about, and I could forget to, because it's just
we should talk about it a little bit more. We should actually help inform everybody as to really what private equity is, because I think that's a term that, in the broadest sense, you could almost say, well, venture capital is private and it's equity typically. So that's private. But no, when people refer to private equity, they're typically referring to a different kind of funding model. Often private equity does things like takes majority stake in a company and essentially assumes control. Sometimes private equity can also be an exit for founders. It works well when if you're a game company, it would mostly work in situations where you've created a cash machine and they can really look at the numbers and the analytics and predict how much more cash it's going to continue to throw off. It also is really attractive in situations where they can use that as a vehicle for rolling up and acquiring other content. So private equity is out there, but Justin, in my experience, that's a later stage thing for a company that's already created the cash machine, like a few million profit typically, as opposed to.
I would say in general, yes. You're absolutely right. The one place that I think it still becomes an interesting opportunity would be talented studios that can potentially, if they have a game or have built a few games, maybe not super sustainable, but that's something that fits with the IP this private equity is partnering with these IP holders with. So while I would agree for most studios, unless you've been around for a while or have existing IP, you being part of a private equity deal in terms of getting money in from them might be a little smaller. But I do think there are opportunities for talented devs that maybe have a good fit for a particular studio joint venture that's with private equity or even with the VC. That would be the opportunity for most of those. So yeah, it is definitely later stage for most folks. But then again, I feel like almost everything's later stage for most folks when it comes to looking for money right now.
So let me swing back on the venture capital, and there are multiple sources of funding available. And I don't mean to diss VC or private equity for that matter. And I'm certainly not out here to tout the traditional publishing model. It's not my position on that. The thing that I do want to reiterate is that you need to understand what the person that you're looking to make a deal with is seeking to get out of that deal. Otherwise, there's going to be dissonance. There's going to be discontent on that. Well, if you're in alignment of what the ultimate goal is, that's probably going to be more satisfactory. Paul?
Well, help me understand some of the framing around that. So I think I'm probably, representing of maybe some of our listeners in that, I have a lot of experience with the studio model, right? I'm a professional who's worked at a number of large studios. I understand how studios select games. The last 2 years especially, maybe if I'm a senior talent who's traditionally worked in a larger studio environment, I either by choice or by not my choice may find myself looking to start something, right? Because the dynamics have shifted dramatically, right? And of course, I understand the basics of this, but usually when I hear suggestions, there's similar to what we're saying. And of course, it depends, right? But I think what a lot of people that I talk to right now who have not been traditionally expert in seeking money, but have a lot of expertise in building, are looking to sort of, partner with somebody that can help them get that initial cost picture stood up, right? And get themselves, I think we all understand, even myself who doesn't have much expertise, I feel like I know I need software before I can go get real money, right? I need to get that first stage, like it's a multi-stage rocket, right? And I need to get that first stage to get the software, because from my experience in studio model, I know that like the thing that terrifies me and keeps me from going indie is frankly user acquisition costs. like dev costs don't scare me, but UA costs terrify me, right? And so I don't know. How do you think about what I'm saying, and what sort of advice would you give somebody like me in this kind of situation?
Larry, you kick it off, and then I've got some thoughts too.
Sure. I'm going to kick it over to you, Justin, in a way, because I'm going to start off by saying, Paul, you can't know everything about everything, and
Exactly.
and the sooner you admit that, the sooner you start learning about things. Very often, the question that you're asking is not what should I do, but who could advise me as to what should I do. And there are places like Xsolla that. Justin, why don't you talk about some of the connections that you can make through Xsolla funding?
Well, so again, mostly funding, like I said, is it's a digital matchmaking solution for folks. But I think the real thing, I think I'm going to turn this back around, and this is maybe an unpopular opinion with a lot of devs listening. And I'm going to go through a few numbers real quick, and I think most of us have seen this and talked about it. But there's a couple elephants in the room that seem to be unpopular to talk about because nobody wants to be delivering this news. And I'll just say it, I've never been shy. Look, I think the indie community in a lot of ways has done itself a huge disservice by convincing themselves that they don't need publishers, or they don't need investors, or they don't need outside help, that everybody is out to screw them. Now, I mean, where there's smoke, there's fire. I've seen a gazillion bad deals in my times. Absolutely. But I can also tell you, I've been a part of more deals that have been blown up by the developer than by the publisher. So there's plenty of this going around. So I think one of the real fundamental issues is, let's just be clear, is it's misalignment of goals, and it's a misunderstanding of what people really need in the marketplace, coupled with, let's look, 18,000+ games on Steam last year. 75% of them did not make more than $5,000. So my new expression is, if a game ships in the forest. So Paul, you talked about user acquisition. I can't tell you how many of those games ship with no plan, no marketing, they just think putting up a game on Steam, somehow users will find it, they'll get enough reviews. The number of people that I have tell me, oh, well, the algorithm and I'll get promotion. Like, you're relying on stuff that is just a pipe dream. I think that the fundamental misunderstanding about all of this is if you're building an indie game, you have to assume you're not going to get funding. Right. I hate to say it, but less than 1% of the games that get pitched get funding. Now, some of those go find alternative means, but as far as trackability, less than 1% of the games that are out there being pitched get funding. So to assume that you're going to be that game, and even that's the right funding for you, is a mistake. And I don't want to discourage people. I think you've got to dream big, but execute small. I think you've got to first and foremost define who your audience is for whatever you're building and why they are going to care. So let's also be clear. And this is not meant to be bad news. This is more like, this is just kind of a reality check, right? Like if you don't know, as somebody who's an investor, but also been a publisher, if you don't know who your audience is, I can't help you, My job as an investor or publisher is to give you the means and the ability to reach them and or grow that audience. But if you don't have a very specific target in mind, who's going to care and why, and you're not creating new customers. There's 3 billion gamers in the world now. I don't care how special you think your game is. The odds of you taking somebody who's never played games or never cared about games before, and your game is somehow going to get them to start playing games is a leap that, good. If you can find that game, great. I'll throw money at you. But the reality is that's not going to happen.
Just let's pause there for a second, actually, because I think that was really important information for people who are pitching games. And I get to see a lot of game pitches in my role now, running a game tech company, because everybody assumes like I've got a direct line into all the VCs funding games as well, particularly after getting one. So everyone wants to have me refer their pitch deck over to people, which, by the way, I'm happy to do. I'm always happy to help any studio or provide.
And just for the record, I'm also happy to help look at pitches, review. I love this stuff. I love trying to help developers succeed, which is, I think, why I ended up with my job.
What I love about what you said, Justin, is the focus on the audience. So here's the biggest pattern. There's certain patterns that I see in decks for anti-patterns that people are currently putting into a lot of decks that people have always put into decks. First of all, when it's small studios, most game studios are really in love with the idea. They love the product, as they should. Of course, they love the product. They've got a product idea that they want to make and they want to ship. The problem with that is most people realize that your product idea is probably going to change a lot in the course of actually developing the game. The GDD doesn't matter that much, right? Like the GDD these days is the game build. Like just build the game. That's your GDD. Yeah. It's going to keep changing as you work on it. Like the GDD, my most senior developers that worked for me when I had a studio before, they'd laugh at the idea of a GDD. They'd be like, that thing's gonna be so outdated by the time we're 3 weeks into building this game. Like, why do we want to waste our time?
As Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan till you get punched in the nose.
Yeah, and guess what? You better like getting punched in the nose because that's a daily event if you're at a game studio. But this
is the laughter of recognition of yes, that's 100% true.
So the first thing I try to let studios know is first of all, you're largely dealing with people who are financial professionals first and lovers of games second. And your deck has to present a financial case for why this game is going to make money. And that case usually begins with an understanding of the target market and audience that you're going after. And I think compelling teams are ones that can really stand there and say, you know what? We understand this market really well. In fact, we're going to claim we know this market better than anybody. We've played these games. We've worked on these games. We know the communities. We know what they're hungry for. We know the gap in the market. We know what the sales numbers look like on all those games. So I think shifting from product first to more of an audience first, and then making the case that your studio knows that audience better than anybody else, that becomes the compelling case that a studio could make, because then the product can actually change a little bit. You can then say, well, here's our product idea. We're going to start with this and we're going to iterate around it. We're going to have amazing velocity working through the problems. And we know a lot's going to change in the course of working with the community because we're going to test out some new ideas that haven't been tried before. And new ideas always sound great in a GDD. Guess what? They don't always work out great, because games are such complex organisms. There's so many variables. Like the great idea suddenly implodes everything else that makes the game great. So you got to try it. So I really tell people, lead with audience, market size, give a product idea, and then sort of go with what is the roadmap to the next stages? What does this capital get you to? More often than not, the capital doesn't get you to a world-beating, success of a company. Usually it gets you to enough of a version of the game that you can entice people to invest more capital in it. Is kind of the way it works. Game studios never want to hear that. They want all the money to build the game and never look back. But again, it's a financial professional. They want to contain risk. So they want to be like, well, if the capital doesn't get them there, I want to be able to opt out.
Well, and this is one of the things I think that people are forgetting. So we had during the unbridled enthusiasm for the industry, you had, well, I don't want to swear, you had a lot of people, trying to date stars. Let's just put it this way: 6 people from Blizzard, 8 people from Riot, 4 people. Well, I'm a much less language appropriate term that I generally use, but I won't use it on this.
We say starfuckers on this pod. On this.
Okay, then that's exactly the term. And they were going, I'm going to give you 10 million against a 40 million valuation for 6 people. Well, so part of the problem with this is that, one is that you give somebody 10 against 40, they don't spend like they have 10, they spend like they have 40, and they run out of money. They hire all their friends, really high salaries, and then they run out of money. And then something magically, the VCs think a publisher is going to come in and rescue it because they've gotten to a certain point. But again, I want to go back to what you said, John, about the audience. So for me, right, I am an absolute indie game fan, lover. I tried to get indie games built when I was at Capcom. I mean, and I've gone up against this both small and large. But I go back to this, and this is you said something key. Investors, publishers, basically anybody with money is going to treat their investment like a business, and they're going to treat you like a business. If you are not operating your game and your studio like a business, you make it almost impossible for me to invest. And part of that business, and by the way, if you don't have a real clear understanding of who your audience is, then how can you possibly build a budget for your game? Because you don't know what the market potential is. You don't know who the audience is. You don't know the size. So a pretty simple exercise I tell most developers to do is pretend your game is shipping tomorrow. What are the players for your game playing today? And what are the 3 things that are going to get their attention long enough to stop playing that game they're playing now to play your game tomorrow? Right? That helps you with your USPs. It helps you figure out who your audience is and what you're playing. Because the other thing is we're not creating new consumers. You're borrowing your customer from somebody who's already playing another game. There's a bunch of data that came out about 6 months ago that talks most like high consuming indie game players are actually high consuming big game players who decide to take a break and go back and forth. And I think we forget this. And when we're talking to indies, you forget that you're borrowing your customer from somebody. Your brilliant new baby is probably not as brilliant as new as you think it is. So what are the couple things that are going to get somebody to stop playing something else? And if you don't know your market size, how in the heck do you know what kind of game you should build and how much money you should be spending? And that's the way. When I'm looking at a budget, one of the first things I do is I go onto Google and I type the name of the game and the name of the studio. The number of times I see that game's been released by 16 other studios for the last 10 years. The number of times that I see that, the studio doesn't have a website, has no community. I mean, there's all these little things that you do to show that you're legitimate. And there's a bunch of little yellow flags that add up really quickly that show you're not, and not operating like a business is sure one of them. Yeah. And I think, Rami did a big quote. He did this big article a long time ago. Those that know Rami Ismail, it's called Anti-Bullet Points. And it was talking about how to build USPs. And he said that anybody who would never say the opposite about their game, then that's not a USP. So nobody would ever say, I have horribly bad graphics, right? So how could you say great graphics is a unique selling point? I have a horrible story. Nobody would ever say it. So great stories generally unity. So part of this is figuring out the audience and figuring out what's unique to them. And I think so many people want to skip over that and just get into the money to making the game. You get it, and you're missing the point, and you're doing yourself a huge disservice. You're putting yourself on the outs with almost anybody who's going to be interested. And then, frankly, yes, Paul, you said it before. Look, nobody is going out to dinner without having a tasting menu first right now, right? Like, the publishers are kicking the can down the road. They're in no hurry to sign more content. VCs are not in that much of a hurry, although they're usually they're more gamblers than publishers, so they'll take a risk sooner in certain cases. But it's gotten harder, folks. It really has. Yeah.
So, and that means that you got to have a great, I want to call it deck, but it's really not that. I don't want you to think of it as like, it's a PowerPoint deck and that's what gets you money. It's the chain of logic that you're able to present, the narrative that you're able to present. And while there actually are investors who, if they just love the product idea and it was the product that they always wanted to be a part of, that investor exists. They'll write a check because it's their dream project. unless you know the person who like that, it's kind of hard to unearth them in your funding process, though. So for most of us, we would have to go through a chain of logic that sounds like this. And I feel like we're going to have another future episode of this where we go in a deep dive into how to make the killer game pitch deck, because I think that could be really interesting for people. But at a high level, and I think there would be different opinions on this, and feel free to say I'm totally wrong, but I think it starts with the audience. And then it proceeds to, why do you understand that audience really well? Well, that comes down to your team. Your team has expertise in it. And it's because they've shipped games that understand that, or they've worked on those game teams, or at the very least, they've built some prototypes. They have surveyed the market. They have produced some evidence that exposes why they're both passionate about the market and they know something about it. Because when someone looks at a pitch deck and they have the aha moment, they're like, that's really interesting. They noticed something about the market that I hadn't realized. I just learned something from these guys, and they have a really interesting insight. If you present that core insight about the market to them, you actually have a really deep hook in them, because now they want to actually learn from you. They want to hear what your idea is. The product idea, sure, you kind of have to show, like, here's your initial thinking. I don't think it's actually the most important thing in
how many pitches have we gotten between us that have said that the game was going to be, going back 20 years in my career, the next World of Warcraft, but certainly the next Fortnite now, but are unable to tell you why people would stop playing the old Fortnite and move over to the new one. They don't have that hook. They don't have any.
Again, it comes from market understanding, right, Larry? So, like, if you knew that, if you were like deep into Fortnite in the community and you had worked at PUBG or Epic or some similar company with expertise in that, you'd be like, you know what? I'm seeing 10 million players every month, and they're just like, all they want to do is play this mode. Let's make the game all about that mode, and I'm going to ship that and take over a 10 million player market. Now you've got a pitch that sounds really interesting.
You've got research behind you. You've got a compelling business motivation. You're going to be in alignment as to what the goal is, which is to sell those 10 million players on your thing. That's a business approach. I always tell people that what I look for in a pitch deck is a coherent story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what I'm looking for in terms of the presentation.
Let's talk about the end a little bit too, Larry, because I think the punchline of a deck is the ask for money, but also explaining what the money does. And I think this is where 95% of founders get what they're asking for wrong. Asking for the check size is fine, but then they focus on, here's how we're going to spend money. How you're going to spend money actually isn't the most important thing. The impact of that capital is what matters. It's
how that money's going to make you money.
I'm going to raise this many millions of dollars, and my target is to have whatever it is for you. It could be, I'm going to have a community of this size because we're going to scale out a community, or I'm going to ship my beta by this date. And because it's a beta, we're going to have X thousands of wish lists on Steam. Like, explain what the money gets you to.
I advise small indies to go and do research. And first of all, if you've heard any of my presentations, I talk over and over again about making lists, about doing the research, because there is no substitute for that, and you're going to have to do that. But if you want to know what your game is going to sell, find comparables. Find games that are similar to that and look at what they've done. If you're making, any category of game that you want, if you're an indie that you're making a first person shooter, you might want to take a look and say, what are the successful indie developed first person shooters, and what have they done in the marketplace?
So Larry, I'm going to jump in this real quick, and this is, I think, something super key. So I've had a lot of developers ask me, well, why do I need to put comparables in there? You're going to run your own. And the problem with this is that I need you to tell me who your target is, and I will either validate or not. But the number of developers I had, working on $1 million, RPG, telling me their competitors are Breath of the Wild and Breath of Fire, right? I mean, you laugh, Paul, but I can't tell you the number of pitches I get where my $1 million budget game, and I'm putting my comparables of these 100, 200 million franchises or IPs that have been around for years. And it's one thing to tell me that was my inspiration for my $1 million game, but to tell me that's your competitive set tells me you don't understand who your marketing and who your audience is. And that may not be 100% red flag, but that's going to pretty much derail the rest of the talk.
All we need is 1% of their audience.
Yeah, how many people show up with that sort of mindset that actually do get funded, though? So isn't there some? I would think there'd be some pretty heavy selection bias here.
There's been a few that have been funded by some VCs who sort of named nameless a couple of years ago. But again, I think it's right sizing things. And John mentioned this. So Chris Charla, who's the head of ID at Xbox, I think most of us know him fairly well. He has a thing. The most important things in a pitch: gameplay, gameplay, gameplay. And what I like to say is actually, it's a four-sided pyramid if you're really trying to build a successful pitch, right? Gameplay is the base of the pyramid and probably two sides. And the other two sides are the pitch deck, and the other one is the gameplay trailer. And the reason I'm going to say this is that the gameplay trailer is the easiest way to get somebody's attention and show off what the game's going to be like. Make sure that the gameplay trailer isn't an exact match for whatever the build is. Show stuff that I might not see in the build, something that's exciting, something that's cool that maybe I email you, hey, I didn't get to this, where is it? The pitch deck proves to me that you're professional, you have a business idea, and that you know how to execute on that idea. And then the gameplay solves for everything else, right? But that's the
if somebody sends me if somebody sends me what Justin just outlined, it catches my attention immediately.
We got a question here. Are mega rounds like Believer Gardens? We're talking about like these $50 million seed financings that built on a pitch deck.
Let's be clear. The Gardens people in particular spun out of another very successful studio. The pitch that I first saw for Gardens and the one they finally got funding for were about 18 months of iteration and changes. And I won't say actual gameplay, but they had graphics and visuals. So, it'll be interesting to talk to that team when the game finally comes out and they can talk about their journey. But from the first time I saw their first pitch to what I think got funding was about 18 months. And that's the other thing I don't think people understand when they're looking for these larger, bigger checks. And that team had credibility. They had a track record. They had worked on journey. What they were building was, you can see it inspired by. So that was much easier. I'll give a smaller example. Matt Nava, and again, when he founded Giant Squid, came to us with Abzu. Right. And that pitch, the first time I saw it, and maybe one of the only times in my life I've actually signed a pitch without a playable and even without a gameplay video. I went into a suite at the hotel during Indiecade, and on the wall he had this big graphical design, which basically showed the journey the player was going to take as they experienced the game. He had a little bit of music done by Austin Wintory, and then he had a color palette and some other stuff and then you could literally just close your eyes and it would walk you through the player's journey. In 3 minutes in, I could feel myself playing the game, right? Most people don't have that ability, but he was a visual artist, so he's able to do it. So most of us aren't that skilled at being able to communicate the vision that well and that easily without a playable. And I'm stupid, right? Like if you come to me with a pitch and try to get me inside of your head and you don't have visuals, you don't have a playable, you don't have something, I'm already disconnected. I've seen, Larry, we talked about number of pitches. I'm guessing 5,000 to 10,000 pitches in my career now. And this isn't, a game of who's better, who's worse. And it's just that
you win on the number of pitches, Justin. We'll give it to you.
No, they just look, talk to the people, Team 17, they got 2,500 pitches in a year, right? Like, so that number is nothing compared to what a lot of these people see, but you got to remember that it all blends and blurs together. If you can't give me a compelling story and opening line, and some people I used to hate this. I hated the idea of an elevator pitch. When I was at, Capcom, then I was at Activision dealing with Hollywood and Paramount and the Spider-Man game. And every time a Hollywood producer would come to me with this freaking elevator pitch, I just wanted to strangle somebody. Now I get it. And the thing about the elevator pitch is it puts me in the right frame of mind to understand what I'm about to see. And it's going to make me more conducive to understanding the idea. And starts it.
Let me also say the harder it is to explain, the harder it is to sell.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
If guys Justin, you and I have, you've been in the biz longer than I have, but we've got 50 plus years between us. if we don't understand the concept in 30 seconds, your player won't understand the concept in 30 seconds. Your potential player won't.
And that's all you have, by the way. In the TikTok generation, you have 10 to 30 seconds at the most, right? And once you lose that person, you're never getting him back. So going back to this mega rounds, yeah, again, I think you got to look at the teams that got these rounds to understand why they got those rounds they got. So it's always viable if you've got a track record and experience and you can deliver the right pitch at the right time. The reality of that is that's generally not the way most things go.
And it's not a creatable scenario either. I mean, the raw truth of my experience is that if I think about all the games I've worked on and all the games I've been in pitch, there's an inverse correlation between the amount of like the size of the material and the success rate. Usually the biggest deals, the biggest pitches have all been the most succinct, focused, like they were sharp as a razor. And basically the biggest deals I've ever been part of have been the least amount of convincing, right? I
want to remind folks that like most of the biggest franchises in the industry didn't start out that way, right? I worked on the first Call of Duty. It did better than we expected, but really Call of Duty didn't start generating boatloads of cash until the first Modern Warfare, right? Like people forget that some of the biggest franchises we're looking at now didn't start that way. And sure, you look at League of Legends and but it took years and years for them to get that first investment to be successful, really, really successful. And even Fortnite, right? That game was almost canceled, right? It was launched and did horribly until they pivoted. Now they had the money in the bank account to make a huge pivot. But I think too many of us get caught up on these big franchises and like, well, and the VCs do this. They all want this, I wanted this never ending game with live ops that generates, generates 300-400 million a year constantly for a decade. I mean, that's freaking great. But how many of those games are out there and how many of those games that customers can play? And I think that this is where you go ahead, John.
I mean, a couple thoughts on that question though. So first of all, with the right team that has made tons of money before, I think that's the key. If a team is working again to just make tons of money another time and they have a track record, the answer is kind of, those teams have a lot easier access to big pots of capital, and partly they can attract big pots of capital because the team is so star-studded that they also won't work for less than that amount of capital. Like they have to de-risk it for them because their opportunity cost is so high. They're not like, screw you and your $750K seed check. I'm working on something real here. I'm going to build something big, and I've done it before. So forget that. So yes, there's an opportunity cost for the right kind of teams. I mean, ultimately, for venture capital, and I don't think it's necessarily so different for publishers, you kind of need three things. And if you can prove the three things really well, then you can get money. So what are those three things? A target market that's really big and has an urgent need. Okay, the urgent need or the problem, so to speak, in gaming really comes down to a gap in the market which is not currently satisfied by the products that are available. You have to have the ability to execute on a product, whether that's a product idea or sort of a unique insight about that market is maybe the better way to put it. Like an insight that other people haven't really come to realize about that target market, and then a team that knows how the hell they're going to get from point A to point B and turn it into money. Right? If you can prove those three things, there's money out there for you.
Let me just also say that even if you have those three things, the journey is not always easy. Please take a look at our System Shock fundraiser that raised $1.35 million. We had a demo. We had an experienced team. It was going to be a one-year project being done in Unity. It turned into a 7-year privately financed project being done in Unreal, but it won awards at the end of that time. So all's well that ends well. But there's making games.
I don't advise that path for most people.
There is another form of capital, which is there's people in the game industry who have made a ton of money on their game. Just individual super angel. It's a pretty viable way. Now, how do you get money from them? Usually it's because they trust you.
And that's, by the way, that is a great
developer. Path. They really know what the hell they're doing. I'd love to back them on building something, and here's a check. That happens a lot too.
So that's the other thing. That's a path that I think, and I'm glad you brought that up. That is a path I think a lot of people don't think about. But I think even some of the people that have gone off to raise a bit money later, their initial funding came from, I'm going to call it friends and family of the industry. Maybe not their friends and family.
That's your pre-seed round. Instead of VC,
those
pre-seed
people
is angels.
And those people, and there's a lot of them, right? You know, that have made a lot of money in the space that love games. They still will help those games out. Getting to them is difficult. But I do think, you know, again, I think it's you gotta plan and build well and small to start. I think rapid iteration, finding the fun. I think some of those basics got thrown out the window for a couple of years during the pandemic. And I think we got to get back to basics. It's like, you know, why is this fun? What is fun about it? How quickly am I having fun? It's some of these things that got lost, but I think and again, I have a daughter who's almost 20 years old, right? I look at the way she consumes content. It is so different than even people that are in their 30s and 40s consume content. I mean, it is absolutely the TikTok, Instagram Reels generation, right? And so it's like, how quickly can you find the fun and get somebody having fun? And they're not going to keep playing if they're not having fun almost immediately. So there's some things that I think we can do. And I think sometimes developers overcomplicate their big vision and forget to focus on why is this fun. One of the best games I've ever played was a gray box, and I was having so much fun just literally moving things around in that game that I'm like, how do I sign this and how quickly? Because I can only imagine when it's arted up and actually has full design and full levels. And so I think this is one of the things too. I think too many folks are in a rush to get to whatever dream game they want and forget about even most of the best games that were built throughout history didn't start out the best games, right? They started out with a great idea that was executed and then built over time.
Let me
the
also
other thing to
propose
tell people just on the start small theme, you know, I work with a lot of truly indie, you know, 1-man, 2-man, just trying to make their first game. And I tell them all the time, you know, if you want paths to success, there are easy stepping stones. The IGDA, join into game jams. I mean, build up contacts, meet people in the industry, build up a portfolio of work that you can show that this is things that I have done before, and finish things.
Yeah, finish a couple things. I can't tell you, I think, and all of us who've released products understand that you don't know how freaking hard it is to release a product until you spend that last 3 months trying to ship it. Right.
Yep.
And you wonder why we're more like funders and investors, publishers are more likely to sign with a studio that's done it before, even if they weren't widely successful. And there's a reason for that.
Shipping is a
Because
feature.
I just shared a cartoon with my team that said, AAA developer, I wish we had 2 months before ship date. Indie developer, I wish I had a ship date.
I want to share another couple of thoughts as we're coming up kind of on the hour here, but tactics of fundraising. We talked a lot about pitch deck and some of the sources for game funding. I think people are not timing when they pitch properly. You are waiting too long to engage with sources of funding. Let me suggest the way that's better. Like from the day you start your studio and you've decided you're going to build a game company, you can start talking to people about it. You don't have to like spend months and months developing the idea. The purpose of this is you're building relationships and you're not showing them a pitch deck. You're like, here's our idea. It's kind of high big picture. Here's the audience, for example, that we really are going after. And you start to get people excited about what you're going to be building and your insights in this market. And you're like, I'm not raising yet. I'm developing the idea. Maybe we'll raise capital later. And then you come back to them, ideally, not with a pitch deck, but hey, still not quite raising money, but we've got to build. I just wanted to share what I'm doing.
Come back quick with software.
if you can start to show them that you're in a learning process where here's my build. And by the way, every week, like we're learning something new here. And here's a little bit of something different that we figured out. We pivoted in this direction, and you're sharing them the learning along the way and how you're refining it for that audience. And then you pitch them. And you're like, and this is how we're going to build this out. This is the capital that we need to actually realize what we've discovered through this process. And we're talking to a bunch of people and then you continue to show them build. Like then you keep. Then it's like a living pitch.
Showing the progress, yes.
But here's another. Like we keep learning things. Like here's the bit. Like I think velocity in game development and showing builds and showing what you're learning. It's so important because so many investors have been burnt on the you couldn't ship, you couldn't really learn, you couldn't iterate. Velocity, evidence collection, so critical in game development, and frankly, not many teams can do it. And by the way, what I just described is like, so I just described something which means that you probably have a small team working on something and nobody's making any money and no one is getting capital to fund this. And it probably sounds terrifying because it's like, that sounds like I'm signing up for some number of months, 6 months, 12 months working on a game. No one's gonna pay any salaries. And I've got to get a front end developer and a designer and a artist working on this thing to even get that far. Hate to break it to you, that's the tough reality of this industry most of the time. Again, if you've made tons of money for people, you can go out and raise money on a PowerPoint deck. But for most mortals, we have to kind of show evidence that we can actually build this thing. And that's really, really hard. And people want to see the dedication. They want to see that like you want to build this game more than anything else in your life.
It's also good for you as the developer because you might find out this isn't what I want to do.
You might find the idea wasn't that great too when you're iterating it and you're onto a better idea.
Yeah. Well, nothing wrong with that.
Larry, you said something earlier too. It's like, do your homework. I will say this. One of the biggest turnoffs that I come across now is lazy developers that haven't spent any, and again, this sounds funny. And look, I'm guilty of being lazy. I'm just too busy. But I think when I go talk to a developer and they haven't done the homework even on, who it is or who they're talking to or what they're like, just some of the basics. Like if you don't care enough to actually do your homework about what you're building and who you're talking to, how am I going to trust you to care enough to ship this game when stuff gets really hard 18 months from now? Right. Like,
and there's a dark time in every business and every game.
And that's the other thing is I think one of the things that we look for as an investor publisher, and especially as an investor, is I'm investing in the people building this thing, not necessarily what they're building. And my belief they're going to figure it out and make it work. But I'm not going to invest in people that I don't believe, one, is can fix problems or deal with issues. And two, I'm not going to invest in people that I don't think are going to do the homework and are lazy about it, because there's always that pivotal point. And John, your business, you've had to pivot God knows how many times to survive. There's always at least one, if not several points where if you can't figure it out, you're out of business. And I am going to have a tough time giving somebody money to trust them with it if I don't believe that when the going gets tough, they're not going to be able to figure it out. And so if you can't do a little homework, some basics, some understanding of the market, the audience, community, sometimes the best way to prove your idea, because you all say that we don't have any vision way. Build a community around it. Get the community talking about how much they want your game, how much they want features. And sometimes you're going to find it maybe at a point where you have a lot more power in your negotiation because now you have this huge community behind you that's dying for this game. And the amount of leverage the publisher or investor has actually decreases and it puts you in a better position. So you might actually find yourself not needing funding, although most of the time you will, or needing less funding or be able to demand more from your partner by being judicious in your approach.
There you go. Well said, Justin.
Awesome. Well done.
All right, we're past the hour. We could easily talk about this subject for another 2-3 hours. Easy. I feel like we just created a roadmap of some future episodes of this. We should do a deep dive in venture capital too. Like, despite some of the comments earlier, it's not dead. Like, there are people still.
By the way, I didn't mean to insinuate that either. I have tons of friends in venture capital.
But it is a lot harder. They're being more cautious. Their deals are slower. A lot of them are raising their own funds right now, so they're stuck also raising more of the capital that they then redistribute to individual companies. So it's not the greatest time to be raising, but they do have money. Like, it is happening, and here's the good thing. They're literally in the business of investing the money. They have to invest it. They have to find a place for it at some point. So you could be that place. It is just
you might be the helper. You might be the one that helps them
funding games, right? So that's also a great option. We should go on a deep dive on all of these, and a pitch deck seminar could be amazing. So I don't know. We got 3 more episodes. Justin, Larry, I want to really thank you for being here on this. We'll have you back for all of the above. Thanks so much for sitting in and being part of the game development live stream here. This is, I'm seeing some comments. Yes, it is being streamed, but it will be available. So you'll be able to watch it and replay and recirculate it and share it with your friends. And hopefully there were some nuggets of wisdom here that you can share to anybody who's trying to build their dream game. I think there's options for you out there, and don't lose hope, but do persevere. Be prepared for it to take a long time, and pour your energy into it, and just be ready for a long road, and show movement and traction or development progress. All of the above help you get there. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, of course, Paul Oscar, for making this happen.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Until next time, we'll be back next week, Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern.
Thank you.
Until then, bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.